Hi guys, it's Vanessa coming to you from the garden in Central Texas, just northwest of Austin, Texas, in the suburbs. That puts me on the edge of zone 8B and 9A, and it's almost early June, which means we need to talk about what you can plant to grow over the summertime successfully and easily here in the Texas region. We start thinking a little differently when it comes to what can we plant over the summertime, because the list of things that you can easily plant and maintain during the summer here in Texas is going to be a lot smaller than what we would plant in the spring. So essentially we treat these things as cover crops. Typically a cover crop is something that you would plant that would give more than it takes from the soil, or it at least protects your soil from the harsh rays of the sun, which can degrade the microbiome of exposed soil in your garden. Now, typically things that grow well over the summer in Texas are things that will not require very much water, have a type of either mucilage or grow under the ground in a way where they do not struggle to maintain their root temps, and or they protect your garden by giving it some type of shade because they grow nice and tall. So let's start with my favorite one, and that's sweet potatoes. And yes, these are sweet potatoes sitting in soil, and then they have leaves and vines coming off of them. This is what we call sweet potato slips, and these are grocery store sweet potatoes. If you would like to learn more about how to grow sweet potatoes from slip all the way to harvest, I'll have a video at the top of the screen with a link that you can go check that out. Now, the latest I will plant sweet potatoes is usually mid to late July. So you do have some time if you don't have any sweet potato slips started right now. One sweet potato can produce literally hundreds of sweet potatoes if you just keep propagating the slips off of them. And I like planting my sweet potatoes in soil like this and leaving them outside after my threat of frost has passed, because when I rip off this sweet potato slip, it already has roots on it. And then I can take this and plant it right in the soil, either in a container that's large enough or in the ground, and I can get growing on my sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes can take generally about 120 to 200 days to get to full maturity. So we'll count backwards from our average first frost date in the fall to calculate how much time we need to actually get those slips growing and producing in time for Thanksgiving, which is usually just before my first frost. And sweet potatoes aren't sweet when you first harvest them. They need about 4 to 6 weeks to cure and let their sugars kind of settle into the flesh of the root or tuber. And so I like to time mine to where I can pick them at least 4 to 6 weeks before Thanksgiving. If you live in northern Texas, that means that you want to calculate planting your sweet potatoes probably no later than July 1st, because you may get quite a bit colder before I will in central Texas. And sweet potatoes really do not like temps below 50 degrees at nighttime. You can grow sweet potato vines vertically if you feel like you don't have room, and I will show you what that looks like, because I have sweet potatoes that pop up all over my yard now because I've planted them for years. They do tend to climb if they're looking for light, but you will need to take this vine and tell it where to go, unlike something like pole beans that likes to grow vertically up. But nevertheless, it is really pretty to have a nice pretty tower or obelisk of sweet potato vines. And this is what the sweet potatoes growing out of the ground in between my bed have decided to do over this trellis. These leaves are completely edible, and when they're grown in a little bit of shade, they actually are a little more tender and not as strong in flavor. Some sweet potato plants are cultivated to grow more like a bush, so they're less unruly, but for the most part, the majority of sweet potatoes you'll get from the grocery store will grow with just lots of vines all over the ground. The coolest thing about these vines is that the leaves are edible and they are packed with nutrition. I tend to like to grow something called the garnet yam, which I have listed in my sweet potato video as one of my favorite varieties to grow, just because it grows so well here. I can get it from my local Whole Foods, but you can grow ones from H-E-B or your local Brookshire Brothers, and it becomes my nice, tender, delicate summer spinach. Now, you want to make sure you leave enough leaves on your plant to where it can still photosynthesize and create good, healthy tubers for you, but the vines are so vigorous that you don't have to worry about picking too many of the leaves typically when it comes to just pulling a few off to scramble with some eggs or toss into a salad. My next favorite plant to grow over the summertime that's pretty low maintenance is okra. Now, if you're not a big okra fan, one thing I will implore you to try is to utilize planting okra plants in your garden as a sunblock to potentially the the afternoon sun that may come in and blast parts of your garden in the summer. It has beautiful hibiscus-like flowers, so even if you choose not to eat the okra, you can totally just pick them and throw them in your compost. But the leaves and the towering plants, which can get up to 15 to 18 feet tall for me each season, are a great way to utilize a plant as part of your shade structure. And okra trees can be sturdy enough, just like a sunflower stalk. At the end of the season, you can peel the leaves off and then dry those stalks and actually use them as real trellis support come spring. I have okra that I planted probably about 20 to 25 days ago, but maybe a little bit less, honestly. They were direct sowed and I did not soak the seeds or do anything. I just put them in the soil. I typically like to wait until the soil has warmed up quite a bit. So usually once I am a little uncomfortable outside is when I will plant my okra, but you can plant okra as late as mid-summer here in Texas and it will still have time to produce for you. Now with okra, you want to make sure that you are picking the okra pods at a size that is manageable, because much like an avocado, okra really only has a few hours to where it is the perfect tenderness and ripeness. After that, it gets too big. So if you go outside in the morning and you see okra pods, depending on the variety you're growing, that are about 4 to 5 inches long, you should pick them right then, because if you come back later that day, they will probably be 2 inches longer. And that would be the most high maintenance part of growing okra. If you miss a few pods, that's okay. Pick them off, throw them in the compost, and it will keep growing okra for you. Like many things that grow in the dead heat of summer here in Texas, okra has something that is heavy in mucilage inside of it. Mucilage is kind of that gooey stickiness and the sliminess that some people lovingly refer to as a characteristic that okra has. But that mucilage is very good for our stomachs and for hydrating us in the summertime, much like cactus. So okra is really great if you can get it into your diet, whether it be fresh picked, young, and raw. I like to air fry mine or grill mine. Of course, throwing in gumbo soups and stews. It's great as a thickener in your stews, but it also adds flavor and texture and that mucilage. But one of my favorite ways to utilize okra medicinally is to just take okra, cut it down the middle or chop it up, throw it into a big jar of water in the fridge and let it steep for a few days. And it's not really that offensive of a flavor at that point. It stays pretty neutral and fresh tasting. You can do a squeeze of lemon and sipping on that throughout the day. If you have heartburn, gut ulcers, or constipation, it can really help with those things. This is my plea, if you have not grown okra, to give it a shot. Now you'll see the arch I'm standing underneath is covered in some type of vine, and that type of vine is a pole bean vine. These are the super productive pole beans from Jerry's garden, and they do really well going into the really hotter months, and they're nice and sweet tasting still, and they are stringless, so I really enjoy growing these. But even a regular green bean that grows as a pole bean will start to have issues with pollination as it gets hotter outside. The extreme heat and humidity that happens in the summertime here makes pollen really sticky and sometimes sterilizes it. So you may start to see green beans that look pretty like this start to get a little bit wonky. When this starts to happen, it may be time for you to opt for growing an Asian long bean, or what I like to call noodle beans or asparagus beans. These beans are a pole bean variety that grow in the dead heat of the summer because they are in the black-eyed pea or the cow pea family. So when I have open spaces in my trellises, or if I feel like these vines are just not producing anymore, I will start to take a few of the vines out and start direct sowing some Asian long beans in their place. And that way I can start to have more pole beans and things that are great for stir fries and soups and stews over the summertime to keep my yields continually producing. Now this area may look pretty chaotic, but this is actually bush beans, and they grow a lot lower, and like a bush, they don't technically need any support because they support themselves and they don't get as big, and they are very productive in a small time frame, but they will eventually succumb to the heat as well. So black-eyed peas or cow peas or purple whole peas are something that you can grow in place of bush beans in your garden over the summer heat, and they add lots of nitrogen to your soil. They can act as a trap crop for things like leaf-footed bugs and stink bugs and sometimes aphids, and you can pick them and dry them and use them over the winter time to eat or eat them fresh. This crazy looking vine behind me on the ground is actually a tromboncino vine, but it also is in the same family of squash as the C. moschata squash family, which Seminole pumpkin is also in the same family of. Now, These flowers are huge and beautiful and really good stuffed and fried, or just put on top of salads and pizzas. And if you have trouble with squash vine borers, but you really, really want to grow pumpkins this year, you need to consider growing the Seminole pumpkin. texasgarden.com sells them, but you can find the seeds online pretty typically this time of year. You will just need to make sure that you are protecting those plants in the first few weeks of them growing, because the squash vine borer is active, and if you have squash bugs in your area, it can be a problem as well. But if you get them going between now and early July, you still have time to get some smaller pumpkin varieties growing before Halloween. If you were just set on trying to grow jack-o'-lanterns, you're going to need to protect those plants really, really well from squash vine borers for the majority of their life cycle, which can be really difficult when it gets extremely hot outside. So I implore you to consider growing pumpkin or winter squash that make here for storage for decor and for edible purposes that are in the C. moschata family. I'll put a list in the caption of this video of those different types of varieties, and I'll try to find you some links of places you can order seeds. Now, the best part about growing during the active growing season in Texas is that a lot of these things will vine that you can plant. And in the wintertime, there's not a lot of stuff that vines. If you would like something that is resistant and does not even get attention from squash vine borers, that tastes kind of like a squash and kind of like an okra, that grows on a vine, that may help cover a trellis and provide the rest of your garden with shade, you should be considering growing the ridge gourd loofah. Ridge gourd loofah is basically Chinese okra, and it can be dried like a loofah, and I'll show you what those loofah look like. It's a little bit harder to peel once it's dried to get the loofah underneath it, and the loofah is a little bit different texture than your regular smooth loofah. But I will eat the young ones for a few months or a few weeks, depending on how early I plant this plant. It loves the heat. It conserves water, so it doesn't need as much irrigation as your typical squash vining plant will. And it is delicious. I like to pick mine when they're about maybe 8 inches long and usually about that big around, but it's totally up to you and you can kind of play around with it. Loofah flowers tend to open at night, so you won't see them opening during the day typically, but young ridge gourd loofah looks super funky like this. And that's the flower at the end, and then this gets bigger, and you can see it has ridges on it, and that's why it's called ridge gourd. Now, for non-edible purposes, you can totally plant regular smooth loofah right now, but you are reaching the tail end of the time that you'll need for that plant to get started from seed, take off, which it will a little bit faster now that it's really hot outside, and then it needs to fully vine and then start setting flowers, and then those flowers have to get pollinated, and pollinators are in shorter supply once it gets really hot outside. And then those plants will need to grow to full maturity on the vine, and then at least get to a point where they are overly mature and able to start drying themselves. Now, you can get lucky and pick some loofah early, but they need to already be making that change. And so loofah tends to need over 200 days to get to that stage, and it's 200 days of frost-free weather. So consider that sweet potatoes and loofah are great for over the summertime, but you need to get them going soon. Now, because we have such a long growing season in Texas, you totally can plant more peppers right now if you want to. And the smaller varieties of peppers, as in the fruit themselves that are smaller, kind of like this chili pepper plant, are going to thrive in the heat. The smaller the flower when it comes to a nightshade variety of vegetable, that is a shorter distance that the pollen within those perfect flowers, because they have the male and female parts both inside of the flower, it does not have to travel as far from the male to the female part. And so it's a little bit easier for things to get properly pollinated this time of year when it gets extremely hot outside. This does not only apply to peppers, it applies to eggplants and tomatoes, which is why if you decided to plant another tomato right now for over the summertime, you would want to opt for cherry tomato varieties or smaller fruiting varieties, because the flowers on those plants are going to be a lot tinier than a big slicing heirloom tomato. So I try to mix up and make sure I've got some cherry tomato plants growing in the dead heat of the summer. And these are the larger flowers on the Cherokee purple tomatoes, which are already starting to slow down a little bit on fruit set. And you can see the difference here on the super tiny flowers that are on the Sweet 100 tomatoes that I have planted over in this bed. And these are planted inside of the new Garden in Minutes 64-inch tall tomato cages that actually fit perfectly in a 1 square foot space. So I'm super excited to try these out. And I know that I'm not going to get as many big slicer tomatoes after our temps go go above 90 degrees consistently every day. And more importantly, when nighttime temps get above 72 to 74 degrees, the plants just don't have the ability to cool off at night and rest as well, which is why in Houston and South Texas, you may already be experiencing problems with plants showing signs of stress that you may not be able to do anything about. Now, when we get into the really intense part of the summer heat, there are some plants that can just absolutely thrive in really hot, humid conditions. And one of those plants is ginger, the other one being turmeric. These are tropical and subtropical varieties of rhizomes that we grow under the surface, and the leaves are beautiful on top of the surface of the soil. This specific pot is ginger, and this is what the leaves look like. And I just planted some rhizomes that were organic from the grocery store and some that I had left over from last year's harvest, because non-organic rhizomes can sometimes be radiated, which slows down their spread of their rhizomes and they don't sprout as easily. These leaves are also edible and delicious in curries and stir fries. This plant just really benefits from having a little bit of afternoon shade. This is my blue turmeric that I have growing in a couple areas in the garden. Now in the fall, I planted some strawberry plants in both of my green stalk vertical planters. And because some of them are June bearing berries, they are just now starting to set fruit. So let's take a look at what some of these look like. And just know that I have shade cloth above us, which gives these plants quite a bit of protection, as well as us getting a lot of rain recently. So they've been very adequately watered. Now you may see the trellis right beside me is not very well covered, but that's because it has some of my summer plants that I've already planted. And one of those is actually the cucumber I like to grow over the summertime called the Armenian cucumber. The Armenian cucumber is actually a melon, but you can pickle it. It pickles just fine. It's very refreshing. And there are different types of Armenian cucumber. So the skin can look striped, or it can look all white, or it can look like a regular old cucumber, and they can get very, very big. Then I also have a smaller personal melon growing on the other side of this trellis that will hopefully kind of meet the Armenian cucumber at the top of the trellis. And I like growing smaller personal melons at the beginning of the season because I have so many other things going on. I don't want to worry about actually making sure that a gigantic watermelon is being perfectly babied. And it's working out really well right now because of the torrential flooding we have had off and on. That probably would have cracked a giant watermelon if I had one growing right now. But speaking of melons, usually in June, I am starting to direct sow some crimson sweet watermelon or rattlesnake watermelons, just so I can have something that vines along the ground and kind of covers the soil and thrives in the extreme heat here in Texas. Other cucumbers that do well in the heat are Asian varieties like the China Jade cucumber I have here and the Suya Long. And I find these white Wonder or Silver Slicer cucumbers do pretty well as well. Now, these look really similar to the Armenian cucumber. That's what these leaves are. So you can kind of tell, even though it is a melon, it really is a lot like a cucumber. And this is what those individual melons look like for the snacking. I think they're kind of like the Kajari melon. I don't know. It's new seeds to me. Someone gave me the seeds. So we will see if any of these make it to maturity. This is also when I'll be harvesting anything else that's left over from the winter time. And look at this big old beet that I had growing. We've covered a good amount of the food groups right now that you can grow over the summertime, like potatoes instead of white potatoes, because white potatoes get harvested around May. Okra, pumpkins, squash, and ridge gourd loofah. Cowpeas, Asian long beans, also great for filling up a meal. Now, as far as aromatics and leafy greens, of course, we talked about eating the leafy greens of the sweet potato vines, but two other ones that are great for growing are a longevity spinach or perpetual spinach. Perpetual spinach you can get seeds for. Longevity spinach has to be grown from a cutting. Ford Hook Giant White Swiss Chard. Chard is great in the summer heat, to be honest with you. It does really well for me, but in South Texas, it might struggle a bit unless you can grow it in the shade. And it is a biennial, which means in the first season, it will not shoot up a stalk and flower or bolt. but in the second season it will. Sometimes in our long growing seasons here in Texas, it will get confused and it will do it like at the end of the summertime for you. As far as aromatics go, I'm just finishing up harvesting the rest of my bulbing onions, but you can feel good about direct sowing some bunching onion seeds or just getting the bottoms of the green onions from your grocery store and replanting those. That way you can at least have some type of onion growing all the way through the active growing season while bulbing onions are curing for you inside and you're using those up, or if you didn't grow bulbing onions this year, and that's totally okay. Now, if you had cilantro growing, it probably looks like this by now because it does not like the heat. So some alternatives you can grow through the heat are papalo and culantro. Culantro, I got the seeds on Etsy, and papalo's from Jera's garden. Now, basil is something that you can continuously sow as an aromatic underneath the shade of other taller veggies like tomatoes right now, but it will start to bolt faster and faster, and a lot of culinary basil tastes kind of grassy and honestly like Bermuda grass once it has bolted and it's really hot outside. So as far as other basils go, Thai basil is really great still for cooking, and it can handle the heat quite a bit better without tasting too grassy. And holy basil, which is something I love to use, also known as tulsi, in teas. It grows straight through the heat, makes beautiful purple flowers, and you can still consume it once it has flowered. So I use it as an ornamental, but I also consume it. And right about now is when I am direct sowing those seeds or putting some transplants out that I may have started a few weeks ago. This just goes in any open spaces that I have that I want to support pollinators with, and also stock my apothecary and tea collection. Another great aromatic that grows straight through the heat is lemongrass. Lemongrass grows really, really well here in Central Texas, and you can still grow it in North Texas. It just may die back and not come back the next year if you're too far north, but in most parts of Texas, it will die back to the ground and then come back the next season. If you grow it in a pot, you may need to protect it a little bit more. It's also great soup, stews, stir fries, and marinades, but I also use lemongrass in tea. And to round out some of the things I grow over the summertime for my tea apothecary stash is Roselle hibiscus, also known as Florida Jamaica, I believe. I'm white, so don't get upset about my pronunciation of that, but it's one of my favorite things to grow for my tea stash. It is in the Okra hibiscus family. It grows really tall like okra. It's a great alternative if you really don't want to grow okra, and the flowers are beautiful. It looks like this when it's young, and then it will typically flower and then have little calyxes that you would then harvest and take the pit out of and then dry those, and then you can store that to use for tea. It's a huge vitamin C hit, which is perfect to harvest it at the end of the summertime going into the fall when cold and flu season hits, but it also is somewhat of a cooling, drying diuretic that can help cool your body temperature down in the middle of the summertime. My favorite drink being fresh watermelon and Roselle hibiscus flowers as an agua fresca in the summertime to drink to cool down. And of course, the easiest thing for you to plant in any open areas that you may want to keep covered or just keep growing in over the summertime are flowers. So there's a handful of flowers that grow really well in the heat here in Texas, those being zinnias and sunflowers, amaranth, which is also an edible leafy green, but beautiful sprays of tassels that can be dried, and the seeds can be used much like quinoa, but the tassels before they have gone fully to seed are great put in bouquets or dried and put in bouquets. And gomphrena is in the amaranth family. It's called globe amaranth, and it looks like this. Also really great for drying and putting into bouquets even fresh. When it comes to sunflowers, you want to make sure you're direct sowing some every 2 to 4 weeks if you have time, because the blooms are somewhat short-lived depending on the variety. With zinnias, I'll try to plant some new ones about every 4 weeks to have continual blooms, but zinnias can bloom continuously, especially if you're picking them regularly, for 8 to 10, 12 weeks sometimes, depending on how humid it is by you, because they are a little susceptible to mildew and fungal issues. Salvia is a great perennial that you can pop in throughout the garden and has many different colors. And for a more dainty, heat weather tolerant flower, cosmos come in a few different colors. They're really pretty and they tolerate really poor soil conditions. The biggest things you can do to help your garden, whether you're planting things over the summertime in Texas or not, is to make sure your soil is covered with either heavy layers of mulch or living plants. Try to figure out your irrigation situation. Even if you don't have things fully set up right now and it's getting too hot for you to get out there and do really long projects, consider grabbing some cheap soaker hoses and laying them around areas of plants that you're really invested in. Put a little twist timer for 10 minutes, 15 minutes on your outlet, and then you can let that soaker hose go and give a deep soaking without you having to stand out in the heat. That's a great way to get yourself by over the summertime. Growing plants that are more tolerant to drought conditions can be very, very helpful as well. And if you can, erecting and some shade cloth over at least your most tender vegetables can extend your growing season for things like tomatoes, pole beans, and cucumbers, and some delicate herbs. I hope this video has been helpful for you as a Texas gardener or a Southern gardener to know what you can get ready to plant still right now and going into our most extreme weather of the season and find some form of success. It's worth it to go ahead and try some new things each season to see what you enjoy growing, and if you even want to be outside this time of year messing with the garden. Playing around, getting creative, trying new things each year is how we grow personally and as gardeners. So remember, if you never grow, you'll never know.